Hello and welcome to On Deadline. I'm Dennis Owens.
And I'm Kendra Nichols.
I'm Amanda St. Hilaire. Thanks for joining us.
If you're listening for the first time, we are journalists for ABC 27 News in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
But on this podcast, we talk about issues that affect people all over.
These are the conversations you don't hear on the news. We're going more in depth and behind the scenes. We're different generations with different perspectives, so we don't always agree.
And that's a good thing. We're also getting very personal, getting very real, and hopefully getting you thinking.
Okay, so we're recording on January 8th, and today we are talking the Me Too movement in general and sexual harassment in the state capitol and state government specifically. In recent weeks, the nationwide conversation has shifted to Pennsylvania. The headlines now coming from the Capitol. We are pleased to have with us two of the women behind those headlines that you've been reading about. They've been on the front lines of this reporting. Angela Columbus of the Philadelphia Inquirer.
Thanks for having me.
And Liz Navratil of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you both for being here. We really do appreciate it. Now, before we talk about where we are today, I want to set the stage a little bit. Angela, you wrote a very powerful column in October as the national story was exploding, and it seemed like weekly there was another high-powered man being toppled, but it didn't come to Pennsylvania until you wrote a column in October. And you did something that I think is unusual for you in giving a personal account. I've watched your reporting and read your reporting for many years, and you don't typically do that.
No, actually, it was the first time I wrote a first-person piece, and it was actually quite scary for me because you put yourself out there in ways that you don't when you are writing other news stories. And the reason I did it was because, after the Harvey Weinstein story broke nationally, you started seeing state houses across the country being just slammed with stories about politicians and bad behavior against lobbyists, against other people who work in the Capitol. And I thought to myself, why not? Why isn't it happening here in Pennsylvania? I have observed things over the years.
Meaning, why isn't the bad behavior, or why isn't the reporting or the stories?
Why isn't the reporting coming out of the state capitol in Pennsylvania? The things that we've observed over the years. I thought to myself, I know that there are stories. I know that there are stories out there, and we have to tell them.
So let me set the stage. I picked 4 paragraphs.
Right.
The column was awesome, by the way.
Thank you.
I did retweet it. I thought it was really well done. But four paragraphs in specific. The first time, and this is Angela Columbus writing in October, the first time a male legislator greeted me with a hug and a sloppy kiss on the cheek, I was speechless but not entirely surprised. I raced to the bathroom right after to wash it off with soap and water. You didn't want to name any names there, did you?
I did not name names.
I know you didn't, but do you want to now?
I'm not going to do that now.
All right, your column continued.
You wouldn't be a good reporter if you didn't ask.
Your column continued. And when another lawmaker who I was interviewing in a Capitol hallway began casually stroking my arm as he spoke to me, I removed his hand but shrugged it off as just another example of that high school culture my colleague had warned me about. By the time a one-time legislative leader began relentlessly needling me over the phone that the reason my stories were tough was because I wasn't getting enough sex, I had seen and heard enough to just let it roll off my back instead of giving him the satisfaction of a reaction. Because the truth is, for every skin-crawling example of harassment or assault that you read or hear about, there are nuanced ones that still have the intended effect to mock or degrade. Often they are cloaked in humor, the tired and old, I'm just joking, right? So those are just a couple of the paragraphs of Angela Columbus.
When I read this when I read the one about saying that you weren't getting enough sex, I was like, boy, she must have really had him good. Like his best comeback was, boy, I was like, she must have really had him good, And that's a shame because I think if a male counterpart would have been, putting somebody on the hot coals, they would have never said that to the male.
No. And that's exactly how I felt sitting there, that the reason this legislative leader, and I know this is not going to come as a shock to you, but it was a man, said
because
it
they
was
always are.
Because they always are, and they really still are, with some exceptions. There are some women legislators in leadership, but they are not.
It's lesser leadership.
Exactly. It's lesser leadership. So, it was a man, and I didn't want to, somebody asked me at the time, why didn't you write about that at the time? And the reason is really simple. As a reporter, you're taught never to insert yourself ever into a story, into a debate, into anything. And this was a good decade ago. So that is really the reason why I never wrote about it.
And you don't want people to be questioning if you do a story about that person, wow, is she really being objective? Because we know we can set ourselves separate from that. But there can be that perception. And I'm curious about what kind of response you got after writing that column?
I was inundated with emails, with phone calls. A lot of them were from people in the Capitol who work in the Capitol. A lot of them were men who said, "Thank you for writing that," which I felt heartened by. And then the phone calls started coming from women who had experienced things in their time at the Capitol with people who work in there. Oftentimes, the people who were doing the alleged harassment were legislators.
Mm-hmm. And so, Liz and Angela, both of you have been it's not just about the column, of course, it's the reporting that you've been digging up. So, Liz, how did you start along that track of focusing on sexual assault?
Well, Angela and I work hand in hand. We come from two newspapers, but we cooperate in Harrisburg. So really, as tips started coming in, it's kind of a how can we divide and conquer, and where can we help each other in the reporting process. I covered crime before coming here, so it was like a weirdly inappropriate fit and natural, natural transition. And crime, huh?
I have to ask this, and I'm not trying to diminish anything, but do you find yourself, and I know people out there asking, are some of these things not true? Do you find yourself looking through these and being objective and just saying, look, some of these might be a little overdramatic? Or do you find yourself doing that? Because I think people out there on the outside are saying, oh, now just everybody's coming out with their own story, and, and we don't
the vetting process.
Yeah.
I was actually, Liz and I were having this conversation. This is some of the most difficult reporting that I have done in my career, which is, I'm going to date myself, but 20 plus years in the business. And it is difficult for the reason that you mentioned. When people come to you with these really heartfelt, often awful stories of experiences they've had, in the back of your mind, aside from listening to them, you have to vet everything that they say, and anything that can be corroborated by a paper, through a different interview, somebody they may have spoken to, you are obligated to do. And we have found ourselves being very honest up front with women. Often it's women who call us, although I understand there are some men who have also been harassed in the Capitol by women. You explain to them, look, I'm going to have to do this, and I need you to understand that, because and at the same time, you're also trying to push them to go on the record, and we can talk more about that, because that is a really big, significant part of this.
I think
go ahead.
A lot of people have the impression that somebody says something and it just magically appears in the paper or on TV, and that's very far from what the actual reporting process is.
Well, it depends on the TV station, but certainly not.
Fair.
I wanted to ask you, so where we stand now, I guess your first story involved Dalen Leach, who's a state senator and running for Congress.
Right.
Also, we've done some reporting with Tim Solobai, who is the fire chief, who is stepping down. Governor Wolf seems to have a zero-tolerance policy.
Yes.
I believe you guys reported that Tom Caltagirone, who's a sitting state representative, Democrat, that there was a payout a couple of years ago over a claim, $250,000.
Yes.
Well, just under $250,000. Because as I learned last week in some of my reporting, $250,000 is the cap at which you can that they'll pay it out. So I guess the payout was $248,000, just under the wire. And we can only suspect more's coming. Is that fair to say?
There are certainly more names in the woodwork. It's just a matter of what we can confirm and when.
At what point do you say, okay, we've gotten what we're going to get? You talk about people going on the record versus off the record. Right. At what point do you know this is ready? Because it's never going to be, well, I shouldn't say never, I guess. Right. It's very rare that you're going to have it caught on camera, the actual actions happening, the indisputable proof that I think, whether it's because of crime TV shows or because of the way technology works, people almost expect or anticipate now.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of when it's ready, I can tell you the things that we have generally looked for, particularly with the first story that we wrote about Senator Leach. We called a lot of people for that story, and what we tried to see was whether this is a pattern of behavior that has continued over the years. And in that case, we talked to 8 women and 3 men about a pattern of behavior that stemmed back a decade. And that was one of the ways we felt that we could vet and verify some of these stories, was to show that it had happened more than once. Now, I should say that he has denied that he has ever touched anybody sexually or inappropriately. And some of that story had to do with inappropriate language and jokes.
And as we know, as members of the PLCA, which hold a Gridiron fundraising dinner every year, which, by the way, this year is in the spring. You can still get good tickets. Dalen is a regular performer there, and he does have a he was a stand-up comedian and has what some might call an over-the-line kind of a sense of humor.
Yes.
And so he was trying to suggest that maybe this was just misconstrued.
Except that it was happening with 20 to 23-year-old women who were just entering the workforce. Some of them were interns. Some of them were campaign workers. And I think that is, and I don't know, Dennis, you tell me. I mean, as a professional, I would think that you want to you don't want to treat women entering the workforce with locker room talk. It's just it's.
Well, yeah, it's not appropriate, probably.
Yeah,
probably.
Depends on the person. I do have sisters,
we talked about this before. Where
when my sisters were of that age, there was...
Sure.
You could have 10 people at the table, and 9 are fine with it, and 1's offended. We've talked about that before.
Right.
And I think that's what he meant by probably.
One of the powerful things about your column and about your reporting is it goes into the area where I think largely women have been unsure. So there are certain things that, as a society, we agree this is bad. And I've gotten emails from people saying, well, unless it's an actual rape, people should just stay quiet about it. And sometimes that's the mentality. And then when you get into a touch here, a touch there, a comment here, it becomes this slippery slope where you do question, do I report this? But then if you don't and something comes out later, everyone goes, well, why didn't you report it?
Well, I was talking with 2 male staffers just last week, both of which they're very prominent staffers. And the one guy said, right before Christmas, a lobbyist was in. I gave her a hug. We had there was kind of an inappropriate joke. I've known her for a while, but a couple of days later, I said to her, "Oh my goodness, I hope that wasn't taken the wrong way." And he said that the female lobbyist said to him, "Would you knock that off?" I mean, now are people overthinking? For instance, I even brought up the fact that as I was leaving for Christmas, I gave you a kiss on the kind of the side of the head, said "Merry Christmas" in the newsroom as walking out, and then. And I'm, by the way, because this is not visual, I'm pointing at Amanda St. Clair.
Hi, guys.
And I did have a thought of, boy, was that wrong or whatever? And obviously there's, but in my heart, I know that I'm not following it up with any creepy suggestions or something.
But I would rather people overthink it than underthink it.
I think the fact that you're thinking about it is because for all of this to change, people have to start thinking about those things. Yes. And as you realize, you process it, that's okay. You guys are friends. You guys know each other. But the fact that men, mostly men, but yes, women too, are starting to think, okay, wait, is that appropriate? I think that's a good thing. Even one of my good friends, James Crummell, and I have been friends forever. When all this happened, he went to give me a hug, and he's like, "Can I give you a hug?" And I'm like, "Yes, you can give me a hug." And maybe some people think that's overreacting, but I think that's the start of a new thought process. And it's not going to change if we don't start asking these questions.
It's different if there's a power dynamic at play too.
Right.
So, Dennis, you're not my boss.
Oh, no, I'm not.
But
probably the reverse is true.
It's different when it's someone who has say over your career. Yeah. And I think that's kind of a repeated pattern that we've seen in your reporting.
Yes. And this isn't something that anybody prepares you for in college and says, here's what you do if your boss does something that makes you uncomfortable, or here's where the lines are. And I think that's why you do sort of see these patterns in some of the cases where it tends to be younger people who might be more vulnerable.
And honestly, the lines can be different for different people, and that is also part of the issue.
There's a human dynamic there, right?
Right.
And we've talked too about the continuum. So if I tell a joke or say something that makes you feel uncomfortable and it's a one-time thing, to did I inappropriately touch you, all the way to the far end of this thing where it's a groping or a touching, or some of these stories we're hearing about these powerful guys just, hey, show up at the hotel and they're not wearing any clothes, that kind of thing. So clearly there's a difference in in violation.
There are some clear-cut, yes, that's wrong.
But what I liked about your column also, Angela, and it's a story we've done here. We've done this in the podcast, and I've done this story numerous times on TV. There aren't enough women. We've not had a woman governor. We've not had a woman senator.
Right.
We have no women right now in the congressional delegation. We have one of the lowest percentages in our state legislature. And I have a feeling we're going to see a change in that. I think that's coming.
Yeah, and if it actually, there have been, even with the female legislators that we do have, they have become very vocal on this very issue, proposing legislation to try and curb sexual harassment, to try and curb these, secret payouts for harassment claims, trying to make it harder to make these types of things confidential. And there's a real debate that needs to be had about that, because it isn't quite as simple as just
But it's
saying,
also not undoable, because I hear them say, oh, the victim. Look, we do stories about people who are accused of rape without naming the rape victim. We do that every day.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
So there's ways of notifying who the harasser is. I sometimes think they intentionally set up these obstacles down there at the Capitol and the people that are in power so that, we can't do that. Because I have an idea of, why don't we garnish a pension? If a payout was paid, why don't we garnish the pension? But the powers that be at the Capitol, you can't touch a pension. Mm-hmm. Oh, really? That's interesting.
I'm curious about, kind of going off that, about the different things that exist in order to protect the powerful. What were your experiences as women confronting these powerful men about allegations they did something wrong and, hey, you're going to do a story about it?
I think it kind of depends on which sector you're talking with, number one. But part of it is a lot of times we'll hear either on or off the record this, it goes the opposite way, right? I've had an uncomfortable conversation with this woman, or uncomfortable touching or whatever. So that's been a sort of interesting reaction.
Kind of the whataboutism.
Right. And I think the other thing that has been interesting, Angela mentioned these women who are coming together really across party lines to try and push some of this legislation. But by and large, a lot of the leadership has been quiet in terms of whether they will push this through. And they're the ones who set the agenda. So while we might be hearing a lot, the question that remains to be seen is, will there be actual action? And I think if you're not in the Capitol covering it, it's very easy to forget that these guys have been gone since before the winter holidays. They don't come back until January 22nd in the House and the Senate. So I think it'll be a little bit before we get a real good gauge
to see if the mood or the has changed there.
I can tell you the first story that we did with Senator Leach, we requested an on-the-record interview with him and were denied, and instead a lawyer, his Philadelphia lawyer, called us. But this was the first contact with the newspaper, and I had never received this in my entire career, was a cease and desist order.
I think the guy who wrote the book on Donald Trump just got
right. Like not
on your story.
Not on the story, on calling people, which was even, this is what I'm saying, I've never been asked by anybody, don't call people about me.
How did that go over, by the way? When you picked your jaw back up, and then maybe stop laughing.
I was going to say, how long were you laughing over that?
But so in Dalen Leach's op-ed that came out this past weekend, he says, I was aware that reporters were calling dozens of my employees, former employees, acquaintances, and opponents to ask them if I had ever made them or anyone they knew uncomfortable. And you get the sense that he's writing it almost in a bad way, indicating that it was in itself inappropriate.
Because that's what reporters do.
But isn't that that's you doing your homework? I would be grateful someone was calling so many people to check out a story.
Goes back to the vetting to make sure that these allegations.
And was there a tinge of trying to insinuate that this is a political trick, that one of the women who's complaining is now in cahoots with my opponent?
Yes, and it was a woman who we did not quote in the story or use in any way in the story. And in fact, after the story ran, she went on his Facebook page and made a comment about her experience with him that prompted him to react in anger in a Facebook post in which he called her a monster and a wrecking ball of hate. a comment that he has since taken down, and for which in that op-ed that you mentioned, I think he kind of references, not specifically, but he says that he, after the story ran, he kind of hit a wall and he was really upset, and he's sort of apologetic about it. But that's what that's in reference to.
You two must have pretty thick skin.
Yeah, most days.
Most days. I think that's fair. Most days. I'm the same way. Most days.
You kind of know what you're getting into on stories like these. You never expect them to be like, oh, thanks for writing about this really touchy situation. At least not on the aggressor side.
And one thing I do want to add is, both Liz and I are really sensitive, and most reporters are. We are sensitive to the fact that this is a man's reputation. We don't take that lightly. And we are very cognizant of the fact that these types of stories can make or break careers. So that is why we try and do our homework, and we try and reach out to the person being accused to get their side of the story, because sometimes there can be stuff that comes out during an interview with somebody who's accused that could completely derail a story. And so I urge people when I contact them to talk to us.
Not to
for
send
that reason.
desist orders.
Not
and
to
say
send
not
cease
to
or
talk to
desist
anybody.
orders, right.
I do want to just so that, because we try to get all sides, right? So did you see the column? It was late last week in the New York Times, written by a woman, questioning some of where we're headed. And I just want to read 2 paragraphs from that. So she's, what happened to women's agency? That's what I find myself wondering as I hear story after story of adult women who helplessly acquiesce to sexual demands. I find it especially curious given that a majority of women I know have been in situations in which men have come on to them, at work or otherwise. They have routinely said, I'm not interested, or get your hands off me right now, and they've taken the risk that comes with that. The fact that such unwelcome advances persist, and often in the office, is, yes, evidence of sexism and the abusive power of patriarchy. But I don't believe the scattershot, life-destroying denunciations are the way to spend it. In our current climate, to be accused is to be convicted. Due process is nowhere to be found. Are we concerned about that at all? The due process situation. And again, as I was saying, there's a continuum, okay? I mean, so from, okay, I said something that you don't like, maybe there was some kind of a romantic thing and it didn't go well on your end and you have an axe to grind or something. Right. I'm not saying that's the case in any of your reporting, but it's something we got to pay attention to.
Those are the questions people raise.
Yes. Absolutely.
Sure, and that is one of the reasons why we vet people when they come to us with their stories to see, what might be, is there some sort of negative motivation here for saying what they're saying? It's a really tough question, right? Because, in any type of office situation, you will have relationships and you will have
human interaction,
and you will have, and nobody's, saying that it's not appropriate to, make a joke in front of a colleague or reach out and give them a hug or something, right? I think it is, the harassment comes when somebody is abusing their power in doing that, and using their power to essentially do things that they normally would not do with people they don't know, with people who aren't receptive to it. And I think that's where we try and at least that's our starting line for whether we're going to write a story or not.
And I think a lot of the things that are easy to forget too is especially if it's a boss or a superior of some point, a lot of these people are really reluctant to talk because they don't want to get fired, or they don't want to lose a recommendation when they apply elsewhere, which is a concern some have, or they don't want to lose money down the road, not get that raise. So it can be a very difficult situation for all sides.
Sometimes, too, when people see reporting on accusations of sexual harassment, they think, oh, well, this is a call to get that person fired. And you're not advocating for any, you're saying, here's what we found. We thought you might like to know because this is a person you elect, and this is a person you pay, and this is a person who makes crucial decisions. So I can imagine it can be frustrating. We talked about the response you got for your column, but I'm also interested in the responses you got after the actual reporting, because I'm sure that was a mixed bag.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Particularly on the first piece, I mean, I think that there were people who thought that in Senator Leach's case, some of his behavior was just him being him, and we have just become this overly sensitive society. You know, everybody's a victim. You get that from people, and you know, it's a valid in some instances. I think it's a valid point, not in every instance. So you get that, and then there are people who will say, "Look, you know, this is like we talked about before. This is an abuse of office when it comes to politicians in particular, just in the same way as it would be an abuse of office to misuse taxpayer money or taxpayer resources. This is an abuse that needs to be at the very least looked at. And so that's what we kind of try and explain to people who feel like we're going over the top.
And I, you know, in my personal reporting, if I can share that, I typically have been of the belief that if it's consenting adults, and I know, Amanda, I've spoken with you, if it's consenting adults, I'm not a Peyton Place reporter.
Right,
so
we get people who write in about this affair and that affair.
You hear that
That's
too.
Different.
But if it is, I think my mind is changing now, because if it is a superior and an employee who's much younger, now I think we're in a weird place, and perhaps I need to rethink whether that's reportable.
Well, and I think part of the question is, you know, what are the protocols set up, or the lack of protocols, and maybe that's an issue we look at as well.
Well,
there aren't any.
That might be something my colleague Amanda St. Hilaire is quite familiar with.
Yes. It's just interesting because one thing I hear from people a lot is, you know, it's not really fair to hold people's actions from 5, 10, 20 years, 30 years ago to today's standards. But we don't, if you look at what's on paper, today's standards aren't that different from what was 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago.
However, the world
and
is
that's part
different,
of the point.
though,
The world
from what it
is
was
different.
30
And I
years ago.
understand the argument that, you know, something that happened in the 1980s, the culture is going to be different than it is in 2017, 2018. But there are certain things where even that was not considered widely acceptable workplace behavior, no matter what decade. You know, you talk about even things like Louis C.K. You know, that has never been acceptable workplace behavior. Ever. And so the water, I think, can get kind of muddied with those arguments because we seem to think that if there's any gray area at all, we should deem on the side of it being acceptable. And now I see that shifting a little bit.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think it gets extra interesting with the elected officials because we'll hear from leadership like, oh, we're kind of limited in what we can do. Or if not from the leaders directly, you hear that from their supporters. Like, look, ultimately these guys, their boss is the
voter,
the electorate, right? So it's up to them to make a decision. But then where you run into this sort of interesting circle is that they're not releasing this information, so the voter doesn't have the information to make the decision.
And speaking of not releasing information, that's the area I wanted to get into too, because for me, in some of this reporting, the outrage that I hear is somebody authorized $250,000 in paying out of taxpayer money and felt that it was okay to A, do it, and B, keep it quiet. But that is the system that we have. Is that right?
Yes, very much so. Confidentiality clauses are allowed in these types of settlements, and that is one of the bills that is being pushed, is to, at the very least, do away with confidentiality clauses in settlements in state government and in government, local government too. And like I said, there are arguments on both sides. There are some people who advocate that confidentiality is a good thing. It protects victims as well as people who are accused. And, you know, that is definitely a debate we might hear on the floor if
it gets there.
If it gets there. We haven't heard, like Liz said, we haven't heard anything from leaders. They have, I feel like they have put their heads in the sand on this, and they have taken advantage of the fact that they are not in the Capitol. And you can't grab them in a hallway.
Kind of like that middle of the night pay raise at the summertime where they all left town. Of course, that one didn't die on them, as you remember. And perhaps this one won't either.
I don't think
and I'm sure you will be grabbing them in the hallway once they're back at the Capitol. And I don't know how much of it you can talk about right now, but what's next? What's down the road for you two? How much more can we expect?
I mean, I think we've said we're willing and happy to hear from anybody who feels like there's something that we should be looked into.
For the record, so is ABC 27.
Yeah. No, as you should be. Absolutely.
And I think right now it's, we can't guarantee anything, but we're certainly looking into some other things.
Yeah. And going back to the whole, issue of getting documents, as I'm sure ABC 27 is aware of, you put in a right to know request for information about, anything from an incident report, right. Involving behavior of a legislator, and you can't even get that,
even when there's video.
Right. Can I get on the soapbox? Can I get on a soapbox about this for a second?
Huh?
Can I get on a soapbox about this for a second? Because the right to know process for the House and the Senate, for the legislature, is such that if you get denied, you are basically appealing to the entity that denied you.
And so let's spell it out. So the lawmakers who wrote the law carve themselves out a different system by which they have to go by than everybody else.
So every other government agency, you file a request, they can say, hey, we don't think this should be disclosed because of A, B, or C. You disagree with them. You appeal to the Office of Open Records, which is designed to be a neutral third party, and they make the decision.
It's a great point.
For the legislature, the rules on what you can get are different, and the rules for appeal are different. So you are appealing to the same entity that denied you, and the gymnastics that happens to deny you records. I have a right to know request back of someone telling me that a budget is not, like a specific budget for one particular area, is not a financial document.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
Is not subject to disclosure under the right to know law, even though you are paying for this, and you are paying for the right to know process.
Right. And if once you get denied on appeal when you are seeking a legislative document, your only recourse is to go to the courts. And
Which is very expensive.
And takes a long time.
Takes a long time. If you're a news organization, maybe you can afford it. But, I mean, you got to think about the regular,
Have you paid attention to the bottom lines of news organizations lately?
I'm unfortunately very familiar with that. But imagine how much harder it is for the average citizen to do that.
I think that's a good place to leave
it.
Yeah,
that is.
Well, I'm interested to see if the mood at the Capitol will change as they all start filing back in. And
I am as well. I was talking to Harrisburg State Representative Patty Kim, and she was kind of outraged at some of the reporting about the $250,000, which she had no idea on. And she was very fired up about, somebody authorized that, right? So there's the crime or the alleged crime. There's the payout if that's the crime. But somebody had to say, okay, go ahead and do it. And I think that person, and it by all appearances seems to be the minority leader, who gave it his blessing, and probably some other lawyers that did as well. There needs to be some ramifications there, and that was Patty Kim's point, and maybe some leadership needs to change around here.
I think they're going to have a potentially feisty, tough meeting when they come back.
Right.
Yeah. All right, we're going to leave it there. Ladies, thank you so much for being here.
Thank
Liz
you.
and Angela, we really
Thanks
do
for having
appreciate
us.
it. Thank you so much. Okay, if you'd like to check out the links to the stories, articles, and videos we discussed, you can find them in our show notes on our website, abc27.com. To get On Deadline delivered directly to your phone, tablet, or computer each week, subscribe in iTunes or Google Play Music. Please take a few minutes, leave us a review in iTunes. We do read them, and your thoughts help us figure out what we're doing well and what we can improve upon. If you have any news tips for the ABC 27 investigators or any questions, topics you'd like us to discuss during our weekly podcast, please send us a message on the ABC 27 Investigators Facebook page. Thank you to Eric Semmel for producing this podcast, Jason Dietz for composing and recording the music. But it's time for us to go because we're on deadline.